Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
The Progressive Era, what was it? Nobody knew they were living in a thing called the Progressive Age. You know, it's a construct of the story.
I'm really interested in trying to put a different face on the period, try to get a sense of America that is defining itself in a different way. African Americans, Mexican Americans, to some extent Native Americans, understand the strategies that they evolved which enabled them to persist and to transcend some really awful kinds of experiences.
A Vital Progressivism, today on A Biography of America.
Traditionally, scholars speak of progressivism as the various middle-class reform efforts to alleviate problems associated with the wrenching changes the United States experienced at the turn of the century. Urbanization, immigration, industrialization led to much dislocation and suffering. Child labor laws, women's suffrage, banking reform, settlement houses for urban women in need, and improved food safety are areas of traditional progressive concern. I want to offer a different perspective on progressivism. At the turn of the century, African-American scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois forecasted that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Building upon that insight, I want to argue that the progressive spirit can be clearly seen in the group-based struggles of peoples of color to realize their hopes and dreams, notwithstanding often overwhelming obstacles. A fundamental aspect of progressivism, therefore, was the continuing freedom struggles of peoples of color. After Reconstruction, the place of blacks in America was a separate and severely restricted world. Lynching emerged as a weapon in the arsenal aimed at keeping blacks in their place. Legal and extra-legal violence went hand in hand with systems of economic repression. A kind of neo-slavery developed, including sharecropping, which kept landless blacks economically shackled. At the turn of the century, Southern whites devised elaborate systems of racial segregation known as Jim Crow. American apartheid extended from schools, churches, and courthouses to water fountains, restaurants, hotels, department stores, and parks. Blacks increasingly turned inward as a community and mobilized for the long haul. Fiery Ida B. Wells, nonetheless, led an impressive international and domestic campaign against lynching. Wells labored tirelessly on behalf of federal action against lynching. It is important to bear in mind that segregation affected all peoples of color in varying degrees, including Indians on reservations. The logic was clear: to make the false notion of white superiority appear natural and right. Indians, like blacks, experienced the whitening of America. Rather than vanishing, as many at the time and since claimed they would, Indians survived. The old ways, rather than vanishing, persisted in the face of genocide and Americanization. Reservations did not lead to the detribalization of Indians. Instead, in spite of the growing American theft of Indian lands, reservations preserved and often extended tribal identities. In many ways, the most revealing feature of the official turn-of-the-century Americanization project was the Indian boarding school. This educational experiment sought to assimilate Indians out of their Indianness, whitening them into good Americans. This policy removed Indian children from their families and reservations, their homes, and isolated them in off-reservation schools like the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. These schools wreaked havoc on the children, their families, their tribes, and reservation life. all aspects of Indian culture were attacked. The outward appearance of these Indians underwent a dramatic transformation. Observe the hair, the clothes, the shoes, and most telling perhaps, the attitude, the demeanor. The tragedy of the Indian boarding school experience can be seen in the philosophy guiding the experiment: kill the Indian and save the man. By 1900, there were over 21,000 Indian children in these schools. The vocational and manual training for boys, as well as the Victorian-inspired domestic training for girls, were ill-suited for a return to reservation life. Moreover, extreme anti-Indian racism severely limited off-reservation opportunities. Homesickness, disease, and alienation were rampant. These factors combined in varying degrees to make the boarding school experience traumatic for many Indian children. Resistance was common. Many who survived were often torn between the two worlds. An impressive number finessed the tension between these worlds. Some used their newfound knowledge and skill to champion Indian rights. Ironically, many of the pioneering red progressives who led the early Indian-directed efforts to alleviate their people's oppression were boarding school veterans. Susan and Suzette LaFlèche, sisters from the Omaha tribe, lectured widely and even lobbied Congress on behalf of Indian rights. Susan was the first Western-trained woman Indian doctor. Suzette argued for Indians becoming full citizens under the United States Constitution. Francis, their brother, was a pioneering anthropologist. Dakota Sioux Charles Alexander Eastman was a red progressive and a founding member of the Society of American Indians, a pioneering native rights organization. This was the first Indian rights organization created and run by Indians for Indians. Like so many of his red progressive colleagues, Eastman endeavored to represent the best of both worlds. He maintained, "I am an Indian, and while I have learned much from civilization for which I am grateful, I have never lost my Indian sense of right and justice. Nevertheless, as long as I live, I am an American." Eastman's sense of two-ness showed a tension between Indianness and Americanness. This tension revealed an ambivalent Americanism common among outsiders to the American mainstream. Asian American is a broad category encompassing a wide variety of different peoples, including Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Asian Indians, and Filipinos. Sojourners sought to make enough money to sustain a homeland connection, eventually planning to return home. Settlers, however, saw their destiny as making it in America. While Chinese exclusion had drastically curtailed Chinese immigration by the turn of the century, Japanese immigration expanded. In response, whites created restrictions aimed primarily at the Japanese. These included alien land laws prohibiting aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning or leasing land. Nonetheless, many Japanese found a measure of success in the agricultural sector, particularly in California. Whites feared and fought success among peoples of color precisely because of the threat, imagined and real, such success represented to white competitors. Indeed, that success blatantly contradicted the very idea of white supremacy. Nonetheless, Asian Americans struggled against the odds to forge viable communities. That these communities were mostly male complicated the task of finding marriage partners and sustaining families. By the early 1900s, laws prevented the immigration to the United States of the wives of Chinese male immigrants. One male Chinese migrant wrote to his wife back in China, "Yesterday I received another of your letters. I could not keep tears from running down my cheeks when thinking about the miserable and needy circumstances of our home and thinking back to the time of our separation. Who could know that the fate is always opposite to man's design? Because I can get no goal, I am detained in this secluded corner of a strange land." Early on April 18, 1906, a powerful earthquake devastated San Francisco. Fires caused by the earthquake destroyed municipal records. As a result, without records to prove otherwise, many Chinese men born in China now claim to have been born in this country. As such, they were entitled to bring their wives to the United States. In short order, the numbers of Chinese women in San Francisco increased dramatically. Like Asian immigrants, Mexican immigrants sought economic opportunity and improved lives within the context of an expanding, increasingly international, capitalist labor market. Like Asians, Mexicans were also typically sojourners and settlers. In addition, Mexican immigrants often participated in a circular or back-and-forth migratory pattern across the border between Mexico and the United States. Long-term Mexican settlement and long-term Mexican heritage in the Southwest and the West made the border a less formidable barrier. In the late 1920s, looking back on his recent life, Zeferino Ramirez was justifiably proud. He had come north seeking work during the Mexican Revolution. In Los Angeles, he encountered job discrimination, but he persevered. He even brought his wife and children to Belvedere, an unincorporated Mexican community in East Los Angeles. After working very hard, including several years as a highway laborer and time as a mortician's assistant, he was able to open his own business, a mortuary. He was one of the first Mexican businessmen in his community. Most Mexicans in the United States and their descendants were not so lucky. They often found themselves caught up in physically taxing and low-paying work in mining, in railroad construction, and low-paying migratory and seasonal work in agriculture. Migrant families often found it more of a challenge to maintain themselves than settled families. Mexican identities already combined native, Spanish, and African peoples. Growing Americanization further enriched these mixed identities. Mexican-American communities reflected creative blendings of Mexican and American cultures. Adaptive families, new social networks, and Spanish-language newspapers illustrated these mixings of Mexican and American worlds. Mexican Americans organized formally to improve their status in the United States. In spite of increasing opposition, Mexican aliens, unlike Asian aliens, could be naturalized. Furthermore, there was some strength in numbers. In 1920, over a quarter of San Antonio's population of 161,000 were Mexicans. Los Angeles's Mexican population was even larger. Farm workers, miners, and railroad workers organized to alleviate a range of injustices. These included a dual wage system that paid Mexicans less than Euro-Americans for the same job. On the formal civil rights front, the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, emerged in the 1920s. Since emancipation, Southern blacks had moved about in the South in search of improved life chances. The Depression of the 1890s intensified that search, increasing migration within and outside the South. By the turn of the century, most still remained poor, Southern-based landless sharecroppers and tenant farmers. The most prominent African-American leader in this period was Booker T. Washington. He counseled accommodation and a de-emphasis on politics and agitation. As the founder of Tuskegee Institute, he emphasized vocational and domestic training as key to uplifting the black masses. Another critical plank in his uplift philosophy was economic nationalism. This meant advocating black community development through the support of black business enterprise. There was much to recommend in this program, especially in light of the raging anti-black racism at the time. Others, notably W.E.B. Du Bois, however, favored a more aggressive political stance, a more militant protest approach, and greater emphasis on a wider variety of educational options for blacks. Du Bois and a group of white and black progressives joined in 1909 to create the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP eventually became the most important civil rights organization in the 20th century. During World War I, however, a flood of African Americans moved northward in search of opportunities opened up by wartime labor needs. This great migration must also be seen as a protest against racial oppression, notably Southern Jim Crow. More than 500,000 blacks were part of the Great Migration from the South to the North. As a result, northern communities like Harlem and New York City and Chicago's South Side grew rapidly. Like the Great Migration, World War I was a turning point for African Americans. The democratic promise of the war was not lost on peoples of color. Many strongly supported the war effort. Many men of color served nobly. Unfortunately for people of color, the democratic promise was a sham. Wartime service and wartime patriotism did not strengthen their citizenship claims. Veterans of color returned to an equally hostile, if not worse, racial regime. On far too many occasions, returning veterans of color met violence and death at the hands of whites. Indeed, during what came to be known as the Red Summer of 1919, there was a gruesome series of anti-black race riots. Hundreds lost their lives. Blacks revealed the ambivalent Americanism I discussed earlier. While sharing in the hope America represented, they fought against the oppression they confronted. At this time, Du Bois spoke of the Negro American's two-ness, the tension between one's Negro-ness and one's American-ness. He explained, one ever feels his two-ness an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. As the histories of Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and Asian Americans illustrate, this ambivalent Americanism is a fundamental issue. Indeed, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line.
Walter, there were a tremendous number of lynchings in the South in the late 19th and early 20th century, and these were unbelievable things. I mean, people were not just hanged, they were burned and roasted alive in front of large crowds. People would pack picnic lunches and get on trains and go to see these harrowing spectacles. And no one wore sheets. It was all out in the open. This is the post-Klan era. What's going on here?
I think one of the ways to think about this is to understand that white supremacy during this period was sort of at its height. There's this scientific campaign to think about and represent black people as not only culturally inferior, but biologically inferior, to, in other words, separate them out from the larger body politic. And when you get this sort of massive campaign to dehumanize and brutalize black people, this sort of horror of lynching is part of a whole strategy to create a view of black people that they are beasts. You have to lynch because black men and black women are not like us, and if you want to bring them under control, you have to use these very, very horrific and violent and barbaric methods of control.
People in the South, black people in the South, like Ida Wells, she fought back.
Ida Wells fought back with every weapon she had and got burned out of her press for doing so in Memphis. But what Ida Wells pointed out with her anti-lynching crusade was that very often the people who were singled out for lynching were the people who were acting most human.
Now here's Booker T. Washington. What's he saying about lynching?
I think there are two Booker T. Washingtons. There's the Booker T. Washington who is the public spokesperson who is trying to bridge the relationships between whites and blacks. And that Booker T. Washington wants to mollify, he wants to soften sort of white opposition to black progress. So he does not come out and vigorously condemn. He softly condemns. He comes at it from a very, very political angle. He is not sort of the thunderous opposition that you see with Ida B. Wells or W.E.B. Du Bois or some of the other more aggressive kinds of leaders, because he figures he has to work behind the scenes with white power brokers to try to get concessions for black people. So he's a sort of a politician in that sense. But I think the private Booker T. Washington is horrified, and I think his letters and a lot of his private interactions with close friends show that.
Think how hard it is to be having to mute your horror and having to establish that kind of doubleness that you just talked about, and how risky it was for Washington even to give the kind of opposition that he did, and to say, all right, I'll take a little bit here, I'll try to get the concessions there. That takes a toll every single day. And
this is the progressive era. They're broad-gauged reforms. There's agitation all over the place. What are Roosevelt progressives and Wilson progressives, what are they saying and doing about this issue?
I think most of them come off very poorly, and that's a generous...
Wilson progressives are Southern progressives for the most part, and Woodrow Wilson is the one who segregates Washington, D.C.
Absolutely horrendous.
No, I think there is, from the top down, sort of a mentality which is, you know, for lack of a better term, really committed to a notion of white supremacy. There are all kinds of ways in which, as I suggested earlier, that many people see this as the worst period, not only because of lynchings, there are race riots.
That's the cruel irony of this.
Yeah.
You know, you have this progressive movement with all this agitation going on, and it seems that under the surface, there's a subset of agitators, you know, who have to do it on their own.
And what I think when we highlight these moments of intense local community-based struggles, we have a lens onto the ordinary lived experience of most people. And from my view, this is an important way to think about American history. Mm-hmm. It's very much the struggles of ordinary people who are often marginalized, you know, because that says as much about America and their relationship to America as an outsider, because the only way you know who an American is, in some ways, is by who you exclude.
Yeah, I mean, the big struggle here, you know, the American dream is not coming to America, it's making it in America, and how people make it against just awful odds sometimes. Those are heroic stories.
Well, one of the amazing things that's happening during the progressive era is that these local struggles are beginning to be linked up, and they're beginning to be linked up by new systems of communication and transportation, and also by new political organizing techniques, so that you get someone like Carrie Chapman Catt, who invents this winning plan for women's suffrage, which was absolutely unique.
Explain
for the
who
first
she
time.
is.
Carrie Chapman Catt, who became the president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. She was an Illinois suffragist. She'd grown up in Iowa. Relatively privileged woman, somebody who, in order to campaign for suffrage, had it written into her marriage contract with her husband that she had to have a certain number of days every year that she'd be allowed to campaign for suffrage. And what she did was to organize the suffrage forces, local suffrage forces in each state, like a political machine. And so what they did in some ways was to use the kind of political organizing techniques that you find among your Roosevelt progressives and Wilson progressives, but to turn them to ends that I think probably Woodrow Wilson didn't anticipate, and when he was confronted with them was very uncomfortable.
I think most national progressive politicians were uncomfortable with street demonstrations. And this is really interesting because it's protest that involves risk-taking. There's risk-taking right across the board, huge risk-taking, you know. Washington was taking risks all the time. One step out of line and he's done. They shut down his operation, you know. Women were taking risks. Margaret Sanger was taking risks in New York with her birth control clinics, getting thrown into jail. And Walter, you wrote about a guy who, a beautiful book about a guy who was taking risks all his life, Frederick Douglass. Where is he at the end of the 19th century, just as these issues are starting to break?
Frederick Douglass dies in 1895. That's the very year that Booker T. Washington becomes the preeminent African-American leader. He gives this speech in Atlanta, which elevates him to this mantle of national leadership, whereas Frederick Douglass had been a very protest-oriented, aggressive leader. As I've suggested earlier, Booker T. Washington was more of a conciliator, more of a compromiser. And I think there is this tension that existed among African-American leaders at the turn of the century, among those like Booker T. Washington, as opposed to those like W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, who offered a more aggressive posture, which called back to the more, called back to the tradition that Frederick Douglass represented. But I think you're talking about risk-taking. The creation of the NAACP in 1909 brings together a whole series of white liberals and radicals who are very, very much taking a risk in terms of, you know, trying to come together with African Americans to think about, well, what can we do to, you know, try to alleviate some of the horrors of lynching, disfranchisement, and all of that. And I think that kind of effort also needs to be recognized and understood.
Why aren't we hearing more about people like this?
Oh my God.
Well, I think, you know, history is written by the victors. History is written by those who have a vision of America as sort of a progressive narrative where you highlight the good and the sunny, where the underside, where the less than positive, where the bleaker aspects are seen as not necessary to sort of a mainstream narrative. And I think not only is that unbalanced, but it's untrue.
Yeah.
And I think what we're trying to do as historians on the cusp of the new millennium is to try to think about ways to represent history that's more inclusive.
For information about A Biography of America, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org. Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.